You are watching the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. The Humanities 101 Foundation welcomes you.
Hey there, Nacho Knots. I'm really glad you're here, and I want you to take a moment wherever you are, just arrive. No need to fix anything, no need to mask anything, just be. I want to start today with a line that many of you have probably heard. It comes from Apple's Think Different campaign, and this is often associated with Steve Jobs. And this is a campaign that celebrated people who challenged norms, questioned expectations, and reshaped the world simply by seeing it differently. So here's to the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the ones who see things differently. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them, but the only thing you can't do is ignore them because they change things. That campaign was meant to celebrate innovators, people who didn't quite fit, people who disrupted systems, people who thought sideways in a world that prefers straight lines. And every time I hear it, I don't think about entrepreneurs or investors. I think about autistic people. Because in many ways, that quote unintentionally captures something that's deeply real about the autistic experience. Not as a slogan, but as a lived reality. Autistic people have always been the ones who see patterns others miss, who question the rules that don't quite make sense, who feel deeply in a world that often rewards disconnection. They're often labeled as difficult, rigid, too intense, too honest, too sensitive, and yet those very traits are the same ones that allow them to notice injustice, to hold on to truth, to imagine alternatives that others cannot yet see. The world loves the idea of the misfit when it comes to a success story, when it comes to polished, retrospective, and easy to celebrate. But in real time, in the present, being that person is not always celebrated. It's corrected. It's redirected. Sometimes, most times, it's punished. And that's where Autism Acceptance Month, April, asks something more of us. Not just to admire difference from a distance, but to recognize that the very traits we claim to value in innovation, creativity, and progress are often the same traits that we ask autistic people to hide in everyday life. So maybe this month is not about awareness alone or acceptance. Maybe it's about alignment. Maybe it's about asking whether we truly believe what we say when we celebrate people who think different. And whether we're willing to build those spaces where those minds are not just tolerated, but understood, supported, and allowed to exist without apology. Because autistic people are not here as exceptions to the rule. They're part of the design. And if we take that seriously, then the question shifts. Not to how do we help them fit, but what kind of world are we willing to build when we finally listen to people who have been seeing it differently all along. And this is where our work as Nacho Knots and neuro-affirming believers and practitioners begins to deepen. Because when we talk about building a world that makes room for difference, we're really talking about something much bigger than autism. We're talking about how we respond to human variation itself. Do we design systems that expect sameness and then scramble to accommodate difference? Or do we build with variation in mind from the start? That's the heart of universal design. It's not a favor. It's not an add-on. It's a shift in a mindset. And it says, we are going to assure that people who think differently, process differently, move differently, feel differently, act differently, we're going to build a world that acts accordingly. Remember that predictability shows respect, balance shows care, and joy shows connection. Those are not just ideas. They're design principles for a more humane world. And when we ignore that, when we force people into rigid systems that were never built for them, and when we often label behavior as bad, is really just friction. The sound of a human being trying to exist in a space that doesn't quite fit. It's the mismatch between the person and the environment. So much of what autistic people are asked to do is to absorb that mismatch quietly, to suffer in silence, to mask, to translate, to self-edit, to carry the weight of making everyone else comfortable. And over time, that comes at a cost. And that's not because we are fragile. It's because the constant adaptation without reciprocity is exhausting for anyone. And this is where compassion, as we often talk about it here, becomes something more than a feeling. It becomes a practice. It becomes a design choice, a willingness to say, maybe the next right step is not asking this person to stretch further, but asking the environment to soften. And when we do that, something powerful happens. We begin to see that the traits we once misunderstood are not problems to eliminate, but they're signals to pay attention to. Direct communication becomes clarity. Sensitivity becomes awareness. Deep focus becomes expertise. Pattern recognition becomes insight. What once looked like too much begins to look like exactly what the world has been missing. And that shift, it doesn't just benefit autistic people. It benefits all of us, because the same systems that overwhelm autistic individuals are often the same systems that quietly drain everyone else. The same unpredictability, the same lack of clarity, the same constant pressure to perform instead of simply existing. So when we design for those in the margins, we create conditions where more people can breathe. And maybe that's the invitation for this month, to move from awareness or acceptance to action, from admiration to alignment, from asking people to fit to choosing intentionally to build better fits. And maybe, just maybe, if we listen closely enough to the people who have always seen things differently, we'll start to see a world that reflects a better version of ourselves. And this better version of the world we're building is unfolding right now. Autism Awareness Month is a testament to that, an example of how we shift from mere awareness to action. And in line with that, remember, we got a busy schedule ahead. I'm going to be holding a virtual event at the Genesee District Library this week on the 10th. I'm going to be speaking at the Beautiful Minds Conference at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor on the 14th, and then at the State Capitol in Lansing for the Voices in Action event that's happening the next day on April 15th. And remember, if you'd like me to speak at your event, you can reach out through the website, humanities101.org. And on a related note, I'm thrilled to announce that I'm signing that book deal. In 2027, I'll be publishing a book on autism, masculinity, and raising kind, compassionate men. This is the culmination of all of our work, and it proves that when we look at the world with curiosity and care, truly good things happen. And when I say that good things happen when we lead with curiosity and care, I don't mean that in some abstract feel-good way. I mean that in the most real, complicated, and human sense possible. Because recently, I found myself in conversations and in spaces with people whose views are, frankly, hard to sit with. People whose beliefs are rooted in anger, fear, and in some cases, real harm. And what I've witnessed in those spaces has challenged me because instead of meeting hate with more hate, I've watched people choose something else. I've watched compassion walk into rooms where it had every reason not to. I've watched people stay at a table when it would have been easier and maybe even more justified to walk away or even flip over the table. And over the course of weeks and months, not moments, not some overnight transformation, but slowly and steadily, I've watched what happens when someone who is used to being met with opposition is instead met with dignity. And so this is a story that's been sitting with me. There is a man I know who is deeply rooted in a hate group. And he's not on the margins. He's not passively associated, but he's actively a recruiter, actively promoting someone whose identity, community, and sense of purpose were all tied up in the world of white supremacy. And one day, in the past couple months, he found himself in a conversation with people he had been taught to hate, people he'd been taught to reject, people he had been taught his entire life were the enemy. But instead of hostility, they met him with curiosity. Instead of dismissal, they met him with respect. Instead of dehumanizing him, they refused to stop seeing his humanity. They talked, they listened, they stayed. And something shifted. Not all at once, not cleanly, but enough. Enough for him to begin asking questions. Enough for him to begin noticing cracks in the story he had not been told. Enough for him to imagine something different. And eventually, at great risk to himself, his safety, his relationships, his financial stability, his entire sense of identity, he chose to leave. He chose hope. He chose love. And I want to be really clear about something here. This is not about excusing his past harm. This is not about pretending that beliefs rooted in hate don't have consequences. It's about understanding something deeper. That transformations rarely begin with shame. Transformation rarely begins with exile. It rarely begins with someone being told that they are irredeemable. More often, it begins with someone simply being seen, with someone being met not at the worst thing that they believe, but as a human being capable of believing something different. As a human who believes that they can become something different. And this connects directly to everything we've been talking about. Because autistic people know what it feels like to be misunderstood, to be reduced, to be seen as a problem instead of a person. And what we ask for, what we advocate for, what we demand is not perfection. It's simply humanity. It's patience. It's the chance to be understood rather than corrected. And here's the thread that ties it all together. If compassion has the power to open the heart of someone who has been taught to hate, then imagine what it can do in spaces where people are simply trying to belong. Imagine what happens when we build environments that lead with understanding instead of judgment. That's the world we're talking about. Not a soft world, not an easy world, but a world that believes that people are capable of change and then builds the conditions that make that change possible. And that's where truly good things begin. And maybe that's where we pause together for a moment here, Nacho Knots, because everything we've been circling, difference, compassion, design, belonging, transformation, it all comes back to a very human question. What do we do when we encounter someone who sees the world differently than we do? Not in theory, not in a polished quote, but in real time when it's uncomfortable, when it challenges us, when it asks something of us. Because the truth is, most of us will not be asked to change the entire world this week, but we will be asked in small and quiet ways how we respond to the people in front of us. So here's your participation question for this week. Think about a moment when you encountered someone you saw the world, back up, scratch it. Think about a moment when you encountered someone who saw the world very differently from you. Whether that difference was rooted in neurodivergence, identity, or lived experience. And what did that moment bring up for you? And if you were to approach the same moment again through a lens of curiosity, compassion, and understanding, what might you do differently? And there's no perfect answer here, just an honest one. And as always, I invite you to share your reflections, engage with each other, and hold space for the many different ways we all arrive at understanding. Because sometimes the smallest shift in how we show up is where something new begins. And from there, let's turn to what the research tells us about why these moments matter. And this is where we gently turn from reflection to understanding. Because part of what we do here together is not just sit with these ideas, but we ground them in what research is actually showing us about connection, communication, and difference. There's a recent study that was covered by Science Daily, March 31st, 2026, that speaks directly to this. The research was conducted by a team of psychologists studying how autistic and non-autistic people communicate and form impressions of one another. What they wanted to understand was simple, but it was important. Where do breakdowns in communication actually come from? For a long time, the assumption has been that autistic people struggle socially because of a deficit within them. That difficulty, the belief is that difficulty lies within the individual. But what this study finds has challenged that idea in really meaningful ways. When autistic participants interacted with other autistic participants, their communication was often just as effective, fluid, and socially satisfying as interactions between non-autistic participants. In other words, when people share a similar communication style, things work better. The difficulty showed up most clearly in mixed interactions when autistic and non-autistic participants were paired together. There were misunderstandings that increased, and this is where people reported feeling less connected and where impressions of one another were more likely to be negative or uncertain. And the issue here wasn't that autistic people can't or couldn't communicate. It was that the different communication styles were being met not in a shared framework. The researchers also found something especially important. Non-autistic participants often misread autistic communication more than the reverse. So autistic individuals were not uniquely failing to understand others. It was the allistic or non-autistic people that were failing to understand the autistic communication. The misunderstanding was mutual and in some cases asymmetrical. So from a lay perspective, the takeaway is this. A lot of what we call social difficulty is not one-sided deficit. It's a two-way mismatch. And when we treat one style of communication as a default and the other style as broken, things get messed up. But this study shows that when people are allowed to interact in ways that align with how they naturally process and express information, connection improves. Not because the person changed, but because the conditions match the person more closely. And this connection directly connects to everything we've been talking about. Because what we saw earlier, the story of, my acquaintance leaving a hate group, was not about forcing change through pressure or shame. It was about meeting someone in a way that they could actually be perceived. The same principle is showing up here in the data. Connection doesn't begin with correction. It begins with understanding. And when that understanding is mutual, when both sides are willing to adjust, to listen, to stay in the conversation, something opens up. The research reinforces something many autistic people have been saying for a long time. The differences in communication are not deficits. They're differences in processing, in priorities, and how meaning is built. Some people rely on tone, on subtext, and social intuition. Others rely on clarity, consistency, and directness. Neither is wrong. But when one is centered and the other gets pushed to the margins, again, we see problems. So when we step back and look at this through the lens of the PB&J framework, predictability shows respect. When communication is clear and expectations are transparent, more people can engage. Balance shows care. When both sides are expected to stretch, not just one side, connection becomes shared labor. And joy shows connection. When people feel understood, they relax into authenticity. So as we move forward, hold on to this. What if the problem never was that some people couldn't connect? What if it was that we've been trying to connect without translation? We've been trying to connect without flexibility and without shared design. Because the science is beginning to tell us what lived experience has always known. Connection isn't about fixing people. It's about building environments and situations where understanding has a chance to happen and flourish. And this is where we take that same lens, the same commitment to curiosity and understanding, and apply it to another piece of research that at first glance might seem completely unrelated. But stay with me because the connection is deeper than it appears. There's another study published the same day in Science Daily, and it was led by researchers at a Berlin university working with collaborators across Germany and other countries in Europe. And what they were studying was a rare and devastating childhood condition called Lee syndrome. Now, in simple terms, Lee syndrome is a disorder that affects how the body produces energy at the cellular level. Because the brain and muscles need so much energy to function, those are the systems most impacted. Children with this condition can experience seizure, muscle weakness, loss of mobility, and tragically, a significantly shortened life expectancy. And for a long time, there was a belief that there were no effective treatments. So what these researchers did was something both highly technical and deeply human. They took patient cells, essentially recreated aspects of the disease in a lab setting, and then tested thousands of existing compounds, over 5,500 different compounds, looking for anything that might help. And what they found was unexpected. The pill that most people know as Viagra, more specifically, its active ingredient, sildenafil. Now, that might sound surprising that Viagra was responsive, but this medication also has properties that improve blood flow and cellular function. And it has already been used safely in other medical contexts, including in children. So the researchers moved forward carefully. They conducted a small pilot study with 6 patients, ranging from infants to adults, and what they observed was remarkable. Patients showed stronger muscle function. Some experienced fewer or even no seizures. Others recovered more quickly from dangerous metabolic crises. In one case, a child's walking distance increased tenfold. In another, recurring medical crises stopped altogether. Now, to be clear, this was a trial study. This is early research. It's a small sample. Larger clinical trials are already being planned to confirm these findings, but even at this stage, it represents something powerful. A shift from there's nothing we can do to there might be a path forward. And here's why this matters for us in this conversation and in this moment. Because just like the study we discussed before, this is a story about what happens when we stop assuming we already understand the problem. For years, Lee syndrome has been incredibly difficult to treat, in part because it's rare, it's complex, and it's hard to study directly. But instead of accepting this limitation, these researchers just changed their approach, set a new framework, shifted their mindset. They built new models. They tested widely. They went back to the drawing board, so to say. They stayed open to unexpected answers. And the breakthrough didn't come from creating something entirely new. It came from seeing something familiar in a different way. And that should sound familiar to us because this is the same pattern we've been talking about all episode. Whether we're talking about communication differences or deeply held beliefs or even complex medical conditions, progress often begins when we stop trying to force reality into our existing assumptions. And instead of doing that, we allow ourselves to re-examine what we think we know. In the same way that connection improves when we adjust the environment instead of fixing the person, here, treatment emerged not from forcing the disease into narrowing a pathway, but from expanding the search, from honoring the complexity, from being willing to look again. And maybe that's the deeper takeaway. The breakthroughs, whether in science or relationships or even within ourselves, often come from the same place. Curiosity over certainty, compassion over dismissal, possibility over assumption. Because when we create space for new ways of seeing, we don't just solve problems. We discover entirely new ways forward. So if we stay with this lens of curiosity just a bit, sometimes the most powerful insights don't come from one study, but from noticing a pattern across different kinds of research. So on April 2nd, again published in Science Daily, there's another study. And on the surface, it has nothing to do with autism, communication, or even behavior. It looks at a completely different domain, biology and disease. But the underlying lesson is the same. The study focused on how a deadly parasite, one that causes sleep sickness, survives inside the human body. And what researchers discovered is that that parasite doesn't just overpower the immune system. It hides very precisely. Scientists identified a specific protein that acts almost like a molecular shredder, helping the parasite break down signals that would normally alert the immune system to its presence. In simple terms, the parasite survives not by being stronger, but by being harder to detect. It avoids recognition. It disrupts communication. It changes how signals are received. And because of that, it can remain in the body far, far longer than it should. Now, from a lay perspective, this is why this matters. For years, researchers have been trying to fight diseases like this by attacking them directly. Stronger drugs, more aggressive treatments, trying to overwhelm the threat. But this study shifts that focus. Instead of asking, how do we destroy it? It asks, how is it surviving in the first place? And the answer is this: by interfering with understanding, by disrupting the system that is supposed to recognize and respond. So now, instead of just attacking the parasite, scientists can target the mechanism, the way it hides, the way it interrupts communication, opening the door to more precise and effective treatments. And this is where the connection comes back to us. Because if you zoom out, the story isn't just about biology. It's a story about systems. It's a story about what happens when signals are missed, when communication breaks down, when something important is present but not properly recognized. And when we see this same pattern in the human spaces all the time. When autistic communication is misunderstood, it's not because something is not being expressed. It's because the system receiving it isn't tuned in to recognize it. When someone is stuck in harmful beliefs, it's not because there's no capacity for change or will to do better. It's because the signals that might interrupt that belief system aren't being received in a way that they can land. And what this research reminds us quietly but powerfully is this. Sometimes the issue isn't the presence of something. It's the failure of recognition. So whether we're talking about immune systems, social relationships, or human systems, the question becomes, what are we missing? What signals are being sent but not understood? And what would change if we learned how to recognize those symbols? Because just like the earlier study and the one before that, progress doesn't always come from force. It often comes from clarity, from understanding how things work and then adjusting the system so that connection, recognition, and response can finally happen. And when it does happen, whether in science or in human connection, that's where breakthroughs begin. So finally, let's zoom out one more time, because the last study we're going to look at today takes us out of the lab, out of medicine, and into history, into culture, into something more deeply human. So again, published April 1st from Science Daily out of the University of Sharjah. This was looking at a discovery in the city of Homs, Syria. Now, during restoration work at a historic mosque, researchers uncovered a Greek inscription buried in the foundation of a column. And that inscription may help answer a question historians have been debating for decades. What stood on the site of that mosque? And what they're finding is remarkable. The evidence suggests that this single location may have been over time a pagan temple, then a Christian church, and later a mosque. 3 different religions and religious traditions layered on top of one another across centuries. But here's the part that matters most. The transition between those belief systems wasn't sudden. It wasn't clear. It wasn't one system disappearing and another instantly replacing it. Instead, the research shows that these traditions overlapped. They coexisted. They gradually shifted over time. One of the researchers described it not as a rupture, but as a negotiation, a process of reinterpretation, adaptation, continuity. The same physical space holding different meanings across generations. So from our perspective, why does this matter? Well, we often think of change, whether it's beliefs, identity, culture, or understanding, as something that happens in sharp breaks. Before and after, right and wrong, old self, new self. But this study reminds us that the real change is rarely that simple. It's layered, it's gradual, it's built on what came before, even as it moves towards something new. And that should feel familiar to us by now. Because think about everything we've talked about today. The communication study showed us that connection improves not when people are forced to change, but when understanding grows between different ways of being. The medical study showed us that breakthroughs don't always come from starting over, but sometimes from seeing something familiar in a different way. And now this historical study shows us that even across centuries, transformation doesn't erase what came before. It builds on it. And that brings us back powerfully to the human level. Because when someone begins to change, whether it's an autistic person learning to unmask, or someone stepping away from harmful beliefs, or any of us rethinking who we are, it's rarely a clean break. It's a process. Old frameworks don't disappear overnight. New understanding doesn't root quickly. There's overlap, there's tension, there's growth, and maybe that's not a flaw in the process. Maybe that is the process. So instead of asking, why isn't this change happening faster? Or why isn't this person completely different yet? Maybe the better question is, what layers are still present? And how do we hold space for transformation as it unfolds? Because this study in its own way is telling us something deeply hopeful, that change is possible, and that it always has been happening, and that even in the most complex, layered systems, new meaning can emerge without erasing what came before. And that, my dear Nacho Knots, is not just history. It's a blueprint of how we move forward. Because before we move forward into our affirmations, let's take a moment to gather what we've uncovered together. Because there's a thread running all throughout all of this, and it's deeper than any one story or study can truly tell. We began with that idea of thinking different, not as branding or a slogan, even though it was, but as a lived reality for neurodivergent people. A reality where noticing patterns, questioning norms, and experiencing the world with intensity are often treated as problems, even though those same traits are celebrated when they produce innovation or success. That tension matters because it reveals something about how our systems are built. We don't actually struggle with difference itself. We struggle with difference that shows up in ways we haven't designed for. Then we moved into something more complex, the role of compassion in moments of real conflict. And what we saw there was not a simplistic love fixes everything narrative. It was something more grounded. That transformation begins when someone is met in a way they can actually receive. Not excused, not agreed with, but simply seen. And that insight connects directly to the first study. If communication breakdowns between autistic and non-autistic people are rooted in mismatch, not in deficit, then the responsibility for connection cannot live only on one side. It becomes shared. It becomes relational. It becomes something we design for, not something we demand. And that's a profound shift because it moves us from away from a compliance model where one group is expected to adapt and toward a mutual understanding model where both sides adjust, translate, and meet in the middle. Then the second study expands that idea into how we approach problems more broadly. This is that breakthrough with Viagra that did not come from forcing a narrow solution. It came from widening the search, from questioning assumptions about where answers should come from being willing to look at something familiar and ask, what else might this be capable of doing? And then connects back to people. Because how often do we do the opposite? How often do we see someone once, label them, and then stop looking? Stop wondering what else might be. And the third study pushed this even further. It reminded us that systems don't always fail because something is absent. They fail because something is present but not recognized. Signals are there, meaning is there, communication is happening, but the system isn't receiving it. It isn't tuned in to understanding it. And that's such a powerful parallel for neurodivergence. Autistic communication is not empty. It's not lacking. It's often precise, direct, and meaningful. But when it's filtered through a system that prioritizes different cues like tone, subtext, indirectness, it gets misread. Not because it isn't valid, but because it isn't being recognized on its own terms. And then finally, the historical study gives us the timeline perspective. It reminds us that change is not clean, that identities, beliefs, and systems don't flip overnight. They layer, they overlap, they evolve slowly over time. And that matters, especially when we think about growth. Because whether we're talking about someone unmasking, someone rethinking harmful beliefs, or even ourselves learning to show up differently, we're not replacing oneself with another. We're layering a new understanding onto what already exists. And that means there'll be tension, there'll be friction, There'll be heat. There'll be moments where old patterns and new awareness coexist. And that's not failure. That's transition. It's growth. It's becoming. So when we bring all of this together, the analysis becomes clear. A lot of what we experience as conflict is just mismatch. A lot of what we label as deficit is misrecognition. A lot of what we expect to happen quickly is actually layered and gradual. And the through line in all of it is design. How we design conversations, how we design environments, how we design our expectations of one another. Because when we shift those designs even slightly, we change what becomes possible. Connection becomes more likely. Understanding becomes more accessible, and transformation, real, meaningful transformation, has somewhere to begin. So as we move into our affirmations, I want you to carry not just the summary, but the implication that the world doesn't change only through big moments. It changes through small shifts in how we see, how we listen, and how we choose to meet one another. And those shifts are available to us right now. So now, let's bring this inward. Because everything we've explored, difference, compassion, recognition, and growth, doesn't just live out there in systems and studies. It lives inside of us. It's how we see ourselves. It's how we allow ourselves to be seen. So let's move into our affirmations, and this time, I want to weave them together. First person and second person side by side, because these truths are both something we claim and something we offer. I'm allowed to see the world differently, and you are allowed to see the world differently, and that difference has value. When we hold this, we loosen the pressure to conform and begin to recognize difference as contribution, not deviation. I do not need to shrink my communication to make others comfortable, and you do not need to shrink your communication either. Clarity is a strength. This reminds us that understanding does not come from making ourselves smaller, but from making space for different ways of expressing meaning. I am not a problem to be solved, and you are not a problem to be solved either. We are people to be understood. Here, we shift from fixing to relating, from correction to connection. I can meet difference with curiosity instead of fear, and you can too, even when it feels uncomfortable. This is where growth begins, not in certainty, but in the willingness to stay present in the unknown. I am allowed to grow in layers, and you're allowed to grow in layers. I do not have to erase who I was to become who I am becoming. This grounds us in patience. Change is not replacement. It is integration. I can choose compassion, and you can choose compassion without losing boundaries or a sense of self. Compassion is not surrender. It's a steady, intentional way of engaging that still honors our limits. I am a part of the design, and you are a part of the design. We are not exceptions to it. This is the foundation, not inclusion as an afterthought, but belonging as a starting point. So take a breath with that. And as you carry these into your week, notice how they move between I and you. Because the way we learn to speak to ourselves becomes the way that we learn to speak to others. And the way that we choose to see others often shapes what we allow ourselves to become. And so as we close today, Nacho Knots, I just want to thank you for being here, for staying in these conversations, and for being willing to sit with complexity instead of rushing to simple answers. If something from today resonated with you, carry it gently into your week. You don't have to change it all at once. Just take the next right step. Stay curious. Stay open. Stay human. If this space has been meaningful for you, I invite you to share it with someone who might need it, to leave a reflection or to support the work if you're able. The community grows the way all meaningful things do, one conversation at a time. So remember always, predictability shows respect, balance shows care, joy shows connection. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. I'll see you next week, Nacho Knots.
Thank you for joining us. See you next week. The views and opinions expressed in this video are solely those of the creator and do not reflect the views of any institution, employer, or affiliated organization.